Forget everything Hollywood showed about cowboys sitting down to steak with fresh beans. The reality was way different. These guys spent months in the middle of nowhere, no fridge, nothing. They ate whatever they could: guts, brains, beef tongue, dried meat that had basically turned to stone. Historians have found cowhands' diaries describing meals no one today would touch. Here are 25 real facts. Subscribe to our channel and comment if you knew any of them. Number 1, you look at it and think it's just some regular stew. But the Cowboys called it the pot of courage. And there was a reason. When cattle died on the trail, nothing went to waste. Heart, liver, kidney, guts, everything went into the pot with whatever potatoes and onions were left. The smell was strong and the taste was even worse. But here's the detail most people don't know. Hunger killed more cowhands than outlaw bullets, so choking that down wasn't a choice. It was survival. And you know what those guys did while they ate? They told stories about fights, about death, about crossings. It was their way of turning desperation into something they could live with. They called it courage, but deep down it was just the will not to die. And that, my friend, was the real Old West. Number 2, the starter the Cowboys carried wasn't bought in any store. It was a living dough, kept in a leather pouch tied to the saddle, fermenting with the heat of the horse's body during days of travel. When they stopped to eat, they'd mix that sour paste with flour and water, then fry it in pork fat that had seen better days. The smell was strong enough to scare off a coyote. But here's the detail most people don't know. Some cowboys treated that starter like a pet. They'd name the dough and pass it down from generation to generation. Losing it out in the middle of nowhere meant weeks without bread. That's why they poured molasses on top. It wasn't for taste. It was so they could swallow it without making a face. Speaking of old school skills, most people have forgotten. If you've ever wondered how those pioneers actually built their cabins, furniture, and tools, using nothing but hand tools and rough lumber, there's a crazy collection of more than 16,000 original woodworking plans that someone found and put online. I left the link pinned in the comments for anyone who's curious. Number 3, pot of beans. The Cowboys' fuel that brought whole herds to a stop. Have you ever stopped to think what kept those cowhands going for months in the middle of nowhere? Beans. That's simple. The camp cook would throw dried beans into a kettle with chunks of salty bacon and let it boil for hours until it turned into a thick mush. That same pot stayed on the fire for days in a row, every meal the same as the one before. The men would joke that strong beans gave you extra energy to make it through the trail. What nobody admitted was the real problem: gas and cramps so bad they sometimes stopped the whole herd. Picture hundreds of head of cattle waiting because half the cowboys were doubled over in pain. That was the price of a meal that cost pennies and didn't spoil easily. Number 4, cowboy coffee was something no American today could swallow. The chuck wagon cooks boiled the same grounds over and over all week long. Every morning, they'd pour more water over the old powder and let it boil again. To make the grounds sink, they used a trick. They'd crack in eggshells or toss a pinch of salt into the pot. The result was a thick liquid, dark as motor oil, that tasted like burnt dirt. But those men needed something hot to get through the heavy work. What's interesting is that a lot of Civil War veterans already knew this method from military camps. Coffee was so valuable on the trail that some cowhands would rather go without food than without that steaming black sludge every morning. Number 5. On Old West ranches, nothing was wasted when a bull was slaughtered. And here's the part that'll surprise you. The testicles were considered a delicacy. Cowboys called them prairie oysters because, well, calling them by their real name didn't make anyone hungry. They were sliced, breaded, and tossed into a skillet with hot grease. What's interesting is that this dish turned into a kind of courage test. When a young guy showed up at the ranch looking for work, the old hands would serve this delicacy to see how he'd react. Refusing meant you didn't have the stomach for hard work. Eating it without making a face got you instant respect. To this day, at rural festivals in Texas and Montana, this dish is still served as an authentic Western tradition. Number 6. During the long treks across the West, fresh meat was a rare luxury. Cowboys learned fast that wasting any part of an animal could mean going hungry days later. When they managed to kill a rabbit, the rule was clear. Everything went into the pot. The whole thing went into boiling water, with potatoes and whatever herbs they found along the way. Nobody separated the good cuts from the guts. The organs, in fact, were considered the most nutritious part of the meal. A lot of them would gnaw on the bones, too, to get at the marrow. That wasn't gross to them. It was straight-up survival. A single rabbit could feed a man for 2 days if he knew how to use it right. Today, we throw away what our great-grandparents thought was the best part of the plate. Number 7. Back in the Old West, meat was meat, no matter where it came from. Squirrels were easy to catch and were everywhere. Camp cooks would grab those little critters, clean them, and throw them in a pot with onions and whatever else they had on hand. The stew would cook for hours until the meat fell off the bone. Hungry cowboys, after a full day driving cattle, didn't make a big deal out of it. They'd grab a chunk of hard bread, dunk it in the broth, and eat it all without complaining. Behind the saloons, it was common to see these steaming pots. The smell pulled in workers who didn't have money for a steak. For a few cents, they'd fill their bellies with this squirrel stew. It was survival food, plain and simple. Today it sounds weird, but back then nobody threw away anything that could keep hunger away. Number 8. Corn was the cowboys' saving grace on long trips. They'd take cornmeal, mix it with a little water and salt, and fry that dough in whatever fat they had. Usually old lard that had already been used a bunch of times. The result was these hard little cakes the men called corn dodgers. The big advantage? This food didn't spoil. A cowboy could carry those cakes in his saddlebags for weeks, even months, without worrying. When hunger hit out in the middle of nowhere, he'd break off a piece and chew it slow. To make it taste better, a lot of them would drizzle molasses on top. It wasn't a meal anyone would pick if they had other options. But in the American desert, where the next town could be days away, having something in your stomach made all the difference between pushing on or giving up. Number 9. You walk into an Old West saloon and see a glass jar on the counter with eggs floating in a cloudy liquid. It wasn't decoration. They were pickled eggs in vinegar with salt and spices, and they'd sit there for weeks. Cowboys would roll in after days on the trail, order a whiskey, and grab one of those eggs straight out of the jar with hands dirty from dust. It was cheap protein that didn't spoil easily in a time with no refrigerator. The vinegar preserved them and gave them that strong, sour bite. Saloon owners bought eggs from nearby farms and made gallons of that pickle. The smell was so distinctive it became a trademark of those places. The funny thing is, the habit didn't die. Even today, you can find those jars in old bars out in the countryside, especially in the American South and the Midwest. Number 10. Hardtack was a cracker. So hard, guys would break a tooth if they bit into it straight. Cowboys figured out a smart way around that. They'd smash the stuff with a rock or the handle of a knife and toss it into boiling broth with meat. They'd let it soften until it turned into a thick stew that stuck to your ribs. That cracker could last for years without going bad because it had zero moisture. The Army had used it since the Civil War, and cowhands picked up the idea on long drives. It was cheap, light to carry, and didn't need a refrigerator. When hunger hit after a full day driving cattle, that hot broth with chunks of softened cracker felt like a feast. Simple as that. Necessity turns into invention. Number 11. In the Old West, the buffalo hump was considered the most valuable cut on the whole animal. Hunters would leave tons of meat rotting in the sun and take only that part. The reason was simple. The fat concentrated there melted in your mouth like butter. Cowboys would roast it right in the coals and eat it with their hands, letting the grease run down their fingers. That habit came at a high price. Millions of buffalo were slaughtered in just a few years, nearly driving the species to total extinction. When the herds vanished from the plains, a lot of men who lived off that hunting went truly hungry. The irony is they wasted the whole animal for a single piece of fat. Number 12. That grayish block on the plate was the favorite breakfast for a lot of people in the American countryside. Scrapple was born on Pennsylvania farms, created by German settlers who didn't waste any part of the pig. Head, liver, heart, and even the feet went into the kettle. Everything cooked for hours until it turned into a paste, which was then mixed with cornmeal and seasoned with sage. The mixture cooled in molds and became this gray brick. Early in the morning, they'd slice it thick and fry it in lard until it was crispy on the outside. The strong pork smell filled the kitchen. Cowboys and farmers depended on that cheap protein to get through long days. The funny thing is, this humble dish still exists today in small-town markets in Pennsylvania and Maryland, where it's become a family tradition passed down through generations. Number 13. In the 1880s, nothing went to waste in the Old West. When a steer was slaughtered, even the brain went into the pan. Cooks would take the fresh brains, cut them into pieces, and toss them into a skillet with butter that had already gone off. The result was a dish that was creamy on the inside and crispy on the outside. Cowboys woke up before sunrise and ate it mixed with scrambled eggs. It was the kind of breakfast that kept you going all day in the saddle. The rancid fat gave it a strong flavor that nobody today could handle. But back then, food was fuel, not a luxury. What's interesting is that a lot of families in the southern United States kept this tradition for generations. Some restaurants in Texas still serve this dish as a regional specialty, linking the present to that hard time. Number 14. Jerky saved lives in the Old West, but it came with a price. Cowboys spent weeks far from any town, so they needed food that wouldn't spoil. The solution was to cut meat into thin strips, cover it with coarse salt, and leave it to dry in the sun for days. The result was tough as a boot sole. The men kept pieces in their pants pockets, along with dust and sweat. When hunger hit, they'd tear off a chunk with their teeth and chew for long minutes until it softened. It didn't taste like barbecue. It was salt, fiber, and survival. A lot of them lost teeth trying to bite it. Native peoples had been doing this for centuries with buffalo meat. The settlers learned fast that in the desert, pretty food rots and ugly food keeps you alive. Number 15. In Old West saloons, these pickled pigs' feet sat in huge jars on the counter, right next to the whiskey. Cowhands would show up after weeks on the trail, order a drink, and grab a foot straight out of the jar with their hand. It was working man food, plain and simple. The vinegar kept the meat for months without a refrigerator, so bar owners always kept it stocked. The guys would chew the cartilage and tendons slow, sometimes for hours, while they played cards or closed cattle deals. It had protein, salt, and cost next to nothing. A lot of German and Irish immigrants brought this tradition over from Europe, where no part of the pig was wasted. Today it sounds strange, but back then it made perfect sense. It was the perfect snack for men who lived hard and weren't picky about food. Pure American West. Number 16. During the long journeys across the American West, cowboys faced shortages that are hard to imagine today. When the food ran out and there was no game nearby, they turned to the hooves of dead horses or butchered cattle. The process took time. The hooves would boil in water for 2 or 3 straight days until they broke down into a thick goo. The men believed that mix carried important nutrients to get them through heavy work. The taste was described as something between old leather and rancid fat. A lot of them added salt or whatever herbs they could find along the way to cover up the flavor. This practice shows a harsh reality. In the Old West, surviving meant swallowing whatever was in front of you, no questions asked. Number 17. Before refrigerators existed, nothing went to waste. Milk that went sour became food. Cowboys figured out that this thick, sour milk could still keep you going on long rides. They'd mix it with hard bread to make it through the day. Out in the open, the smell was strong, but hunger was stronger. Interestingly, this habit wasn't just American. People in Mongolia and Eastern Europe had been doing this for centuries. What looked like spoiled food was actually natural fermentation, full of good bacteria for your gut. Today, science confirms it. Those Old West men were eating probiotics without even knowing it. The same idea is in the yogurt you buy at the supermarket. The difference? They drank it straight from the bucket, no fancy label and no health marketing. Sometimes what looks wrong is just old knowledge we forgot. Number 18. When the food ran out in the middle of nowhere, cowboys had to make do with whatever showed up. Porcupine was an unexpected lifesaver. They'd toss the animal straight into the coals, quills and all. The fire burned off that protective layer and left the meat ready to eat. The men called it pine meat because the quills looked like pine needles. The animal was small, but it made a decent meal for someone who'd had an empty stomach for days. According to reports from the time, it tasted like wild pork. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but when you're miles from any town and out of supplies, any protein will do. That kind of resourcefulness separated the ones who survived from the ones who couldn't handle the hard life on the western trails. Number 19. When cattle disappeared from the stagecoach routes in the late 1800s, saloon owners had to improvise. The solution was flying between the pines, wild turkey. Local hunters brought in the birds, and the cook made them with dough dumplings boiled right in the broth. Nothing fancy at all. It was survival food that turned into tradition. What's interesting is that this dish put everyone on the same bench. The cowboy who'd spent weeks in the saddle, the miner covered in dust, and the pro gambler who never took his eyes off the poker table. At that counter, it didn't matter who you were. The smell of roasted turkey was the great social equalizer of the Old West. A lot of historians believe dishes like this helped create the idea that the West was a land of equal opportunity for everyone. Number 20. Back in the days of wagon trains heading west, fresh apples were hard to come by. What survived the trip were dried slices, kept in sacks that bounced around for weeks in the wagons. When they reached frontier towns, the cook would soak them until the slices swelled up and that orchard smell came back. Then came the trick. Water with sugar, cinnamon, and a little nutmeg, all simmering slow in an iron pot on a wood stove. The crust was simple, made with flour and pork lard, kneaded firm so it could handle the heat of the oven. This pie became a symbol of home and comfort in a place where almost nothing was comfortable. Men who spent months in the saddle would pay high prices for a slice. It was a piece of the home they'd left behind and might never see again. Number 21. Johnny cakes saved more lives in the colonies than any doctor back then. This simple, coarse cornmeal dough became the basic fuel for the people pushing into America. Soldiers carried them in their packs, hunters kept them in their pockets, and any roadside tavern had them on the counter. The recipe came straight from Native Americans: coarse cornmeal, hot water, a pinch of salt, and on lucky days, a little pork fat. No oven, no fuss. All you needed was a hot griddle or a stone heated in the fire. The funny thing is, this humble food made it through centuries. Even today, in Rhode Island and parts of the South, you can still find Johnny cakes on the menus at old-school cafes. Few American dishes have a history as old and tough as this corn cake that fed the building of an entire nation. Number 22. In Old West saloons, beef tongue was for special customers. The owner didn't serve it to just anyone who walked through the door. He saved it for the ones who paid on time and kept coming back. It took hours to cook in a deep pot with onions, garlic, and the simple seasonings of the day. After it was cooked and cleaned, it went straight onto the hot griddle. There it browned up and left a golden coating on the pan. That leftover bit became a thick gravy, thickened with flour. It was food for people with money in their pocket who knew what they were asking for. In a time when fresh meat was hard to come by and nothing was wasted, a dish like that showed status. Anyone sitting down to eat tongue in a saloon wasn't just any passing cowboy. It was someone the place wanted to keep around. Number 23. In the Old West, a lot of people walked into a saloon not just to drink, but to see what was coming off the stove. Stale bread, leftover cake, yesterday's cornbread. Nothing went in the trash. It all got chopped up, mixed with milk, eggs, and sugar, and left to sit while the firewood burned down slow. In the oven, the magic happened. Firm around the edges, soft in the middle. On top went a hot sauce of butter, brown sugar, and a generous splash of whiskey. That was bread pudding, a recipe that's been passed down for generations. Fun fact, in the 1800s, wasting food was almost a sin. So saloon cooks became masters at turning scraps into something that made any cowboy come back the next day. This dessert tells a story of hard times when being creative at the stove was a matter of survival. Number 24. Crispy Creek trout. Back in the West, before refrigerators or refrigerated trucks, fresh fish was a rare luxury. Anyone traveling those dusty trails knew that stopping near a creek meant a chance to eat something besides jerky and beans. Camp cooks and roadside saloon cooks had a simple trick that worked every time. They'd take the just-caught trout, still wet, and dredge it straight in a mix of cornmeal with salt and pepper. No complicated recipe. Hot pork fat did the rest. In just a few minutes, that golden crust would crackle on the first bite. What's interesting is that this method came from the first settlers, who learned from native people to use corn in cooking. It became a tradition passed down from generation to generation, and even today, anglers in the Appalachians do it the same way. Number 25. Griddled pork bread. Here's something a lot of people don't know. German immigrants who came to Pennsylvania had a pretty straightforward philosophy about raising pigs. Nothing went to waste, absolutely nothing. When the animal was slaughtered, everything left over, offal, meat scraps, fat, went into a big pot of boiling water with cornmeal and basic seasonings. It cooked down into a thick mash that was poured into rectangular molds. It sat all night, cooling and firming up. Early in the morning, before the sun got hot, someone would slice off slabs of that block and throw them right onto the hot griddle. The result? A golden crust on the outside and a dense center that stuck to your ribs. It was the kind of breakfast that could keep a working man going until noon without a complaint.